What's up, guys? It's Ben from EFI University, and people are always surprised when I tell them I don't tune my EFI systems on professional race cars when I'm at the racetrack. Doesn't matter if I'm at low altitude, high altitude, whether it's hot out, cold out, raining, I don't care. I've already done all that work. One of the biggest mistakes that I find racers make is not using all the tools they have available in their EFI system. So in today's video, I'm going to show you 3 of my advanced tuning tactics that you can incorporate into your drag racing EFI program that will make your life so much easier. All right, let's start here. What I'm talking about is I'm not changing my engine tune-up at the racetrack. That's not to say it isn't changing, but I've got all these things built into my computer that take into account the things that affect my engine, like barometric pressure, temperature, humidity, that sort of stuff. I'm not talking about relying on the closed loop that everybody has and most people are using. I'm talking about setting up my computer to do the work that I need to do so I don't need to retune it. When I say I'm not tuning at the track, I mean I'm not tuning the engine. I'm still going to be doing things like reading the track and changing my power management strategies and all that. But let's start by breaking down the things that are going to affect the way your engine runs. Okay, so number 1 on my list of things that really affect the way your engines run is the barometric pressure. Now, the barometric pressure is what we call atmospheric pressure. It's what's going on all around us, and it changes all the time. It changes if you go up or down in altitude, it changes if a weather system moves in, and it changes if the air temperature goes up or down because it affects the way the engine operates. We need to add or subtract fuel. Sometimes we have to change our ignition timing. And so most people, when they go on the dyno, they're tuning in one specific set of conditions. Then when you move to a different location or a different set of weather moves in, it changes the engine tune-up and they find themselves back on the laptop retuning the engine. I want to show you how you could do it without having to go back to the laptop simply by setting up extra tables beyond the normal fuel and spark stuff that everybody does. Okay, number 2 on my list of things that are going to affect the way the engine runs is the air temperature. As the air temperature gets hotter or colder, it changes the density of the air that the engine's breathing in. Now the thing is, you have an air temperature sensor connected to your engine. Whatever is going into that engine, you're reading it. Whether or not you're using the tables properly to take advantage of that information is a totally different thing. So we're going to take some time and break down how to create tables that automatically compensate for changes in air temperature. Third thing we're going to talk about is one of the more complicated ones because it's a little misleading, and that's humidity. When people talk about humidity, whether they saw it on the news or they got it off a weather station, a lot of times they're going to talk to you about relative humidity. The problem with relative humidity is that's only talking about how much moisture is in the air relative to the temperature of the air. You see, what happens is as air gets hotter, it's able to hold more water. That's why it always feels, for example, hot and humid. You rarely ever hear anybody say, oh, it's really cold and humid today. As that air gets colder, it contracts and shrinks, and it basically squeezes the moisture out of the air, which is why as soon as it cools off, you start to see things like clouds and fog and visible moisture, sometimes in the form of precipitation. But the thing is, the problem with breathing in a bunch of air that's full of moisture content is that the moisture affects the engine's performance in a couple of different ways. First of all, the more water vapor and moisture you have in the air, the more it displaces oxygen and air that you were hoping to mix with fuel and burn. So that's one thing. The second thing is it's really difficult, basically impossible, to burn water. So the more water content we have in the air that the engine's breathing, the harder it is for the combustion process to happen. It basically takes longer to burn the air and fuel mixture, so it affects how much power we make, how much head start I'm gonna need. We tend to use the terms like ignition timing or whatever. So what I'm gonna do is show you how we can automatically compensate for the amount of water vapor in the air. But to do it right, we gotta talk about the right thing. Relative humidity, if I say it's 50% relative or it's 80% relative, that doesn't mean the same thing to the engine all the time because it's dependent on air temperature. So for example, rather than talking about the relative amount of water in the air to the temperature, let's talk about the actual amount of water vapor there is in the air. Typically, the sensors that measure water vapor measure the amount of water in grains per pound. Well, a grain is about 1/7,000th of a pound. So there's 7,000 grains in a pound. So the term water grains per pound means how many grains of water there is for 1 pound of actual air. So the bigger that number is in water grains, the more wet the air would feel. So what we need to do is figure out how many total grains of water are physically in the air that we're breathing. The term relative humidity looks looks at that water vapor, that amount of grains the same way, but it says, well, if your air was really hot, the air isn't really saturated, not close to 100% of all that I could hold, but for the same amount of water, as the air temperature cools down, my relative percentage of saturation goes up. Now you can see this if you watch your weather station throughout the day. If you look at water grains, most of the time they'll stay pretty constant, but early in the morning versus late afternoon, as the sun comes up and it starts to heat the air up, even though the amount of water grains in the air stays the same, the relative humidity will start to go down as the temperature goes up because that hotter air is capable of holding more water. What we care about is not the relative percent humidity, we care about the actual amount of water in the air. All right, when it comes to racing, especially drag racing, you're gonna hear a lot of people talk about weather using terminology that may not always be familiar. So let's talk about it. So one of the things you're gonna hear people say a lot is DA, or density altitude, and you're like, what the heck is density altitude? Well, the combination of barometric pressure, air temperature, and the amount of water grains or water vapor there is in the air account for the performance of the vehicle at a given altitude. So the density altitude is the actual elevation that the car or your racing engine feels like it's at. For example, I could be at a racetrack that's, say, 2,000 feet above sea level. My altitude is 2,000 feet. But the actual weather conditions I get, if I have a different barometric pressure than 2,000 feet normally has, a different amount of temperature, if it's hotter or colder, I have a different amount of water vapor, it will feel like instead of 2,000 feet, I could be at 3 or 4 or 5 or more thousand feet of density altitude, and that has a direct effect on the performance of the vehicle. Instead of talking about just density altitude, you may hear racers talk about correction factor. And when they're talking about correction factor, they're going to use numbers like, I got a 103, or I got a 105 and a half, or I got a 102 or 110. What they're talking about is percentage of difference between the performance your engine would have at sea level versus what you would have today in the conditions you're racing on. So when I say 105, what I mean is 1.05, or roughly 5% worse than I would be if I was at sea level. If you've ever had a car on a chassis dyno or an engine on an engine dyno, you may be familiar with these correction factor numbers because they're the values that are used to calculate the curves that you get on your dyno sheet. You see, there's the amount of power you physically made that day on the dyno. That's called observed power. And then there's the values you get on your dyno sheet, which are corrected from the observed power you physically made that day to show you what it would have made if you were at sea level. Now we do this because everywhere in the country that somebody goes on a dyno, they're gonna get theoretically different weather conditions, so the amount of observed power that you make is affected by that day's weather conditions, and we wanna take that variable out. Therefore, you have to be a little bit careful about looking at corrected power numbers in a dyno sheet. Let me give you an example. The other day, I'm working on a project, and the transmission and the torque converter for this vehicle had a different engine in front of it before we got it. The guy gave us his dyno sheet and it said, oh, this thing makes, 560 horsepower, and the converter stalled at about 5,800 RPM. Well, we took an engine that made less power, about 480, and we put that in the car. Now, theoretically, the torque converter should have stalled at an even lower RPM, all things being equal, but it turned out it actually stalled higher than the RPM of the engine that supposedly made way more power. And it was like, well, how could that be possible? The reason that happened was because the guy that we had got that stuff from lived at a higher elevation. He lived somewhere near Colorado Springs or Denver, so he was typically racing somewhere like Bandimere, where it's not uncommon to have 7, 8, or even 9,000 feet of density altitude. And what that means is, even though your dyno sheet shows your engine made 560 horsepower, where you were actually racing and in the conditions you were racing in, it didn't make 560 horsepower. So what you would logically do is keep tweaking the torque converter, sending it back and getting it modified, the stator and the vanes and the blade angles and all that, until you got the RPM you wanted. The only problem is now we take it down here where we're close to sea level, about 700 or 800 feet of density altitude, and my 480 horsepower engine's actually making more power in reality than the 560 horsepower engine it was replacing when it was racing at 7 or 8 or 9,000 feet of density altitude. So the only thing your torque converter knows and your tires know and the track knows from your vehicle is the physical amount of power you're making on that day. That's why it's so important that we use the tools in the EFI system to compensate for the conditions we have so that we don't have to go in there, plug in the laptop, and retune the engine every time we get different weather. So whether it's density, altitude, or correction factor that you're looking at, it's important to understand its effect on the vehicle and what things change the density, altitude, or correction factor. And again, that's going to be barometric pressure, air temperature, or humidity. So we're going to figure out how we can get that information and what we can do with it. Okay, so now that we know the information we want to get, let's talk about how we're going to measure it. When it comes to baro and air temp, those are fairly easy because most fuel injection systems nowadays have those sensors on board. Now, make sure you don't confuse baro with MAP. The MAP sensor, yes, is manifold absolute pressure, and it does measure the barometric pressure if the engine's not running. But as soon as the engine starts running, every time you move your throttle or your engine speed, the manifold pressure changes, but baro does not. So you really want a separate or dedicated barometric pressure sensor in order to measure that. But again, most ECUs have that on board, so it's pretty easy to get. The second one is your air temperature, and just about every ECU on the planet that's controlling an engine has an intake air temperature sensor. The critical thing is to make sure that the temperature you're measuring is pretty representative of what the engine's actually getting. For example, if you had a supercharger, you wouldn't want to measure the air temperature before it goes in there and creates all the boost, which generates higher temperatures, so the engine would be getting hotter air than you're actually measuring. So whatever measures you've got to take or whatever hoops you have to jump through to make sure you're getting an accurate reading of air temp, make sure you do those so you get the right information. Now the last one, water grains, is a little harder to get. You pretty much need a weather station. Now, some people have weather stations on the top of their race trailers. Some people have little portable ones. There's other ways to get that information though. For example, there's websites like www.airdensityonline.com has this great feature. They have a thing called free weather for racetracks, and you can click on their website, go to that section and look up just about any drag strip anywhere in North America and a bunch around the world even, and they will give you real-time weather data for that track. You could also call the local weather station, like at the news station. You could call local airports. When you call the local airports though, be careful that you're getting the right values. For example, most of the time they're going to give you the barometric pressure that's corrected for altitude. You could be in Denver and the real barometric pressure might be 25.6 inches of mercury, but they'll correct that 5,000 feet and they might call it 29.6 or 30.2 or whatever the value for the physical field elevation is. So that's not the number you want. You want the real barometric pressure. So when it comes to water vapor or water grains, I like to use my weather station on board the car. Now there's a couple of really nice ones that are out there. The ones that come to mind, there's one made by Plimpton Innovations, and my new favorite one is called the Weather Track here that I've got, made in Australia by a company called Connection Concepts. The reason that I like this one is it communicates via CAN. In other words, it plugs into the existing information network on my ECU without taking out a bunch of my inputs and outputs wires for power, ground, and signal. So I'm going to get 8 different channels worth of data out of this, but I'm only going to be on the same CAN low and CAN high wires that I would normally share all the other data from. Instead of 8 sensors that need a power, ground, and a signal, that'd be 24 wires I'd have to hook up to get it. This thing makes it super easy. It comes with a 4-pin Deutsch DPM connector. I take my other one, plug it in like that, and like for example, in my Holley EFI, which I'm gonna be using this weekend, I'm just gonna take this flat 4-pin connector, plug it straight into the Holley CAN data, and boom, we're up and running and ready to go. All right, so now that I've taken the actual weather station, plugged it into my CAN bus, I gotta figure out how to set up the ECU to know that all that data is there. So the way this is gonna work is I'm gonna have 8 channels worth of data, and each of them are coming across on a 5-volt CAN bus network that I'm going to set up through my I/O configuration. So if you don't already have the I/O, that's this little icon right here. What you'd do is you'd go up to Toolbox and you would add the individual config for inputs and outputs. You'll see that comes up. You'd go in here. I have one that's set up already for my weather info, but you might not have that, so you just pick a base config or a demo. So to use this page, you're going to have a bunch of available inputs and outputs, of course. So I've got my 8 inputs already set up here. Let's walk through and look at how it's set up. All right, so for example, in my first one here, I would enable this input channel. I would name it water grains. That's GPP is grains per pound. My type is CAN 5 volts. And now I'm gonna go ahead and configure it. So when I do, it's gonna come up and I'm gonna choose custom 5 volt. I'm gonna go ahead and leave this one unitless because I don't have grains per pound as a unit. I'm gonna leave my format here. This is just how many decimal places you want. So when it comes to water grains, I'm not gonna get to the 1/10 of a grain. So my 0 here is going to be the minimum, and up to a maximum of 150 water grains will set my display scale. So now I'm gonna come down here, and the scaling for this sensor is 0 to 150 grains of water over 0.5 to 4.5 volts. With that, I can go back out and I can set up the scaling for each of my other channels. So you can see I've got water grains, ambient temperature degrees C, humidity percent, so that's my relative humidity, which has to do with the temperature and the water grains. I've got ambient pressure, that's my baro in kPa, and the density altitude in feet. Now I've also got ambient pressure in inches of mercury, I've got density altitude in meters, and I've got ambient temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. So now that I've got all those in there, I can actually use them to do things for me. So you can see my water grains, I got 40 grains of water today with an ambient temperature of 25 degrees C. That's 28% relative humidity, because really 25 degree or 28 degrees, 25 degrees C, if you go down here at the bottom, about 78 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a high temperature that will hold a lot of water. So 40 grains of water really isn't all that much today. So I've got them all set up in my IOs. I can see the real values. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna build some tables to make the ECU look at this data and automatically make changes to my tune-up so that I don't have to. Okay, so the first table that I'm gonna build is one that will compensate for how much fuel I need to give the engine in order to keep my air-fuel ratio correct from the day I tuned it on the dyno to whatever I get today when I'm tuning, because obviously those values are gonna change. So Holley gives you a table in their software to use, but it's typically not filled out. For example, if you go to the fuel tab, the one here that looks like a fuel injector, come down to modifiers, in this middle table here, it's called air temperature enrichment. Typically, there's not much going on in this table as you receive it from the factory, but I fill this table out before I begin tuning the same way every time. So you can copy and paste these numbers, you can save the file and go open it up and copy those into your new file, or you could export this and just use this portion of it for any file you want to build. Now keep in mind, I'm using Holley EFI as a demo in my software demo today, but you might have some other brand and the tables look differently. But most of the time in an aftermarket racing standalone ECU, you can figure out how to build these tables into it and get the same effect. So don't worry about yours being different than mine. But in this one, what I've done is I've gone in here and I've specified a percentage of fuel enrichment, either adding or taking away. See, in this table, 100 would be 100% of the values that are in my normal fuel table. So if I get intake air temperatures that are hotter than or colder than my normal table, whatever I had that day I was tuning, I'm gonna wanna change that. But the problem is I may not always be tuning my engine on a dyno on a perfect sea-level standard day, and that's why I put the values in this table before I ever start tuning, so that that part of the compensation's already done, whether I'm on the dyno or on the racetrack. So to do this, I always start out with the idea that the SAE J607 or MSA Motorsport Standard atmosphere has air temperature around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Really, it's 59 or 15 degrees C. So if you have an intake air temperature that's different than roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit, you're either gonna need to add fuel or take it away. As the air gets colder, you're gonna want to add fuel. As the air gets hotter, you're gonna want to take it away. There's a formula that we can use that's fairly easy to remember. It'll get you pretty close. It's 2.7 times the result of P over T, and that's the absolute pressure in PSI, so that'd be your barometric pressure plus any boost you might have, divided by the absolute temperature. And that would be, look at your thermometer and get the degrees Fahrenheit and add 460. I'm going to leave that scale here because my Holley software uses Fahrenheit, but you can also do this for degrees Celsius if you've got an ECU that uses metric values. The formula changes a little bit where it becomes 0.22 times the result of P over T, and this time the P is in kPa of absolute pressure, and the T is degrees Celsius plus 273. We'll put those up so you can see them somewhere, and you can use those to work out the density of the air that you have on the day that you're doing this. So the way I do this is I don't change my pressure at all. We'll worry about barometric pressure somewhere else, but if only the temperature changed up or down, what percentage would I need to add? And so I just figure out what my actual air density is right now with this temperature, compare that as a percentage to what it would be if I was at the standard air density, and I get a table that looks like this one. So you can see here at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm almost at standard temperature, so that'd be a value of 100. But instead, I'm actually 5 degrees hotter or 6 degrees hotter than standard. So my calculation is that I take away about 0.6% of my fuel. If I was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it would require me to add about 24% more fuel. That's 124.3% of whatever's in my main fuel table. Now, one thing I want to point out here, as you start going the other way, our numbers are going to get smaller. In other words, we're decreasing the fuel content of the charge because my air density is getting smaller and smaller, lighter weight, as my air gets hotter. However, if you notice in my table here, once I got down to about 80%, I just flatline from there on out. By doing that, as the air temperature gets hotter and hotter and hotter than that point, rather than keep taking fuel away with the goal of maintaining the exact same air-fuel ratio, if I flatline it, it naturally causes the air-fuel ratio to get slightly richer as the air temps get hotter, and I'm doing that as a way to prevent some accidental pre-ignition or detonation. Your results don't have to be the same as mine. You can continue that slope if you want. You could do nothing at all and just deal with the error if you want, but this is one of the tactics that I use to make sure that my engine does the same thing regardless of what temperature it's at. Okay, so now I want to deal with my barometric pressure. And the reality is, as the barometric pressure changes, the air density changes and the amount of fuel that my engine requires changes. But the truth is, most of my ECU systems are already looking at manifold absolute pressure here. So when we're talking about drag racing, you're almost always at full throttle. When you're at full throttle in a naturally aspirated engine, you're going to have something fairly close to whatever the barometric pressure is anyway. And so you're naturally going to be reducing some of the fuel you need to just by the fact that you've gone up in altitude or the weather has changed. And so the amount of error you get there is pretty small. In fact, because that error doesn't really change anything other than my air-fuel ratio, it doesn't end up having a huge difference in the performance of the engine. So just between us, I'm not going to mess with that a whole lot. But what I am going to do is I'm going to create a table that changes my spark timing based on my density altitude. What happens is as you go up in altitude, physically or virtually with density altitude, when your piston comes to top dead center, the actual clearance volume is the same, but if your density is lower, the distance between the air and fuel molecules is spread farther apart, and so the amount of advance that you'll need to get the engine to run the same will increase. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build an advanced table. Now in my Holley software, it's just called advanced tables. In your other brands of software, they have different names for it, but basically it's a user configurable or a user definable table. So I've set this one up here as a one-dimensional table called DA timing. In other words, as the density altitude changes, I'm going to offset my timing. So I've called it DA timing. It's a timing offset, and the x-axis in my table here across the bottom is simply the density altitude that's currently being measured by my onboard weather system. And you can see here that it goes from negative 3,000 feet, that'd be below sea level, all the way up to 9,000 feet above sea level. So again, I've set my 0 point here at 100 kPa because I'm pretty close to doing that on the dyno. You could certainly shift your 0 point up or down from here, and this table is just an example of the way that I would set this up based on the kind of engine I was tuning. Some engines will need a more aggressive timing curve to add back in when the density is getting really bad. Some will have a less aggressive curve, a Hemi versus a wedge, a 2-valve versus a 4-valve. I'm going to leave that up to you guys to do your own tuning there and figure out how much you want the timing to change. But once you figure it out, you no longer have to have a tune-up that you plug in the laptop and retune the engine. It just does it 100% automatic. So my table here says at 1,000 feet of density altitude, I do nothing. So that's pretty close to where I am on my dyno. As it goes up in density altitude, I'm adding as much as 6 degrees of advance above what's in my normal spark table when I'm at 9,000 feet. If I ever got to 3,000 feet below sea level, I'd be taking away about 2 degrees because the opposite would be happening. As you go below sea level in density altitude, you're packing more air and fuel molecules into that same space when the piston's at top dead center. So it tends to increase how fast the mixture will burn, and therefore it automatically compensates. All right, so the last one of my big 3 advanced tuning tactics I'm going to share with you is if you have this onboard weather station and the air quality changes because it rains or a storm moves through and it gets more humid or less humid, one of the biggest things that people miss when it comes to humidity or water vapor or water grains in the air is, yes, it changes the air density, but it also changes our combustion process. It has a very big cooling effect, and it tends to slow down the burn when you light the spark plug. If you think it's hard to burn water, so the more water you put in there, the slower your combustion process happens. And so when we look at things like in-cylinder pressure analysis or combustion pressure measurement, we see this pretty obviously. So again, I'm going to leave it up to you to think about how much you might want your timing to change, because different engine configurations are more or less sensitive to that water change. But once you've decided that you want to make a change, again, rather than plugging in your laptop, let's make a table. So I'm going to make an advanced table again. This one I've done as a 2-dimensional table based on gear ratio. The reason I've done it on gear ratio is that the engine tends to lug more in high gear. It tends to sit there on the converter or try to pull through the clutch longer in high gear, so it basically loads the engine up and you're generating more heat. So it might be the kind of thing where you want to do something different in low gear than you do in high gear. You don't have to, just a suggestion. But in here what we can see is I've set up a table that's called water grains timing. It's a timing offset. The x-axis could be something like RPM, and I do that because I may not use all of the engine's RPM range. I might have a loose clutch or a really loose converter, and I don't really need to do anything to the engine's performance until I load the engine up. So I've chosen to do this based on gear ratio and RPM here. So you can see that my y-axis going up the side here is how many water grains I actually have. Again, today I would be at 40, so I'd be in this column, right here. So that's a little bit less water than I would have here. You can see where I'm zeroed out in these columns here between 50 and 80. I tend not to do a whole lot there because that's pretty representative of where I'm gonna dyno and what I'm typically racing at. So what I'm trying to do is say, what happens when it's way more water or way less water than what I was dynoing at? A great example of this would be like a guy with a nitrous car who races in Gainesville, Florida, where it's, high barometric pressure and tons of water vapor, like sticky and hot out. And then maybe he goes to Las Vegas, Nevada, where it's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet of density altitude, but it's arid, dry, and there's almost no water. The nitrous engines have a big swing in how much timing they'll take based on how much water there is, so those guys are constantly retuning. If you do it like this, you won't have to. So you can see here, as my air gets drier and drier, I'm reducing the amount of ignition timing because the mixture tends to burn faster. So I don't need as much head start. As my water vapor goes higher and higher and it gets more and more wet, it slows my burn down, so I've got to add a bunch of timing. And again, you could do this for each gear and think about how much you want to do there. And I'm just using this as an example for you. But now you've got a way, if your barometric pressure changes, if your temperature changes, or your water changes, you've got strategic things that you can implement so you never have to tune at the racetrack again. Well guys, there you have it. Those are 3 of my advanced tuning tactics that you can take and put all of them, some of them or none of them, into your racing program. But I promise you, if you do, you're going to find out that you'll have way more time to focus on the things that actually matter when you're at the drag strip than simply plugging in your laptop and retuning the engine all the time. Hope you enjoy, and I'll see you out there.